So we're actually going to be covering three chapters this week. What I want you to do is here's how I think a realistic approach of tackling this is going to be. So I'm just going to give you a little introduction essay, lecture right here on what we're doing here for this week. And all the different assignments that we have will be covering some aspect of these three huge, major, important topics that we really don't have sufficient time to go over in a cram course. Essentially, we're going to the Depression with the New Deal, and then World War II and the Cold War. Now, again, these are huge, huge topics, and I think many of you are just going to start kind of almost just shutting off. What I want you to do is this, is look at the essay questions that I'm asking. Look at my notes, gloss through the book. So instead of sitting down and reading everything entirely, and instead of skipping the reading altogether, do what my professor used to recommend when I was in grad school, because we had to read so much. It was called mining the text, in which you kind of look for relevant information over the topics that we're going over to talk about, okay? And that's, I think, the best way I'd recommend to do this. And you can utilize, my lectures in a way that if you're listening and taking notes, you should be able to incorporate that information into your papers, okay? So I think that, some students I've talked to have kind of figured out the best way to utilize my what we do every week, okay? And I recommend you to really kind of strategize right now, because we're so close to the end. Now, I'm going to be putting in 2 lectures on World War II and the Cold War from my World Civ class, like I did with World War I. And mainly because I really feel, again, if I in class, if I was teaching this in class, I would kind of like to fuse a little bit more. Or if we had a regular time period that we were going in, I would like to kind of take some more lectures directly out of the book covering the U.S. more specifically, and then integrate it with my World Civ. But realistically, I think with the lack of time, or having to, do things so intensely right now, I'm going to leave it as it is. What I want you to do and see about this, and it's what I've talked about in some of my other lectures, is to realize that World War II, like World War I, involved the world, okay? And not just Europe and not just the United States. And that the United States was important in both wars, but it's still everybody else who's suffering mainly from this time period than the United States. The Soviet Union, probably out of all the countries, got hit the hardest by far. Almost 40% of the casualties of World War II come out of the Soviet Union. Germany was carpet bombed at Dresden by Allied forces, including the United States. The nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if you really look at the war, World War II, Winston Churchill stole, basically the British took grain from Bengal, India, and thousands, some argue millions, there's a debate about the exact numbers, but basically there was a massive famine that killed definitely thousands at the very least of Bengalis to support British troops. So if you were a Bengali in India during World War II, your threat wasn't Hitler, it was Churchill. And I'm only pointing that out to say is that in the middle of the World War, we have to remember that the Third World were still colonial subjects of many of our allies, not necessarily the United States, but many allies. And that if we remember, the Soviet Union is going to come in we're going to make a temporary alliance with the communists to fight Hitler. But ultimately, at the end of the war, the people who, Africa, Middle East, and so on, are really going to see, many people there are going to see the Soviet Union as more of a hero than the West, because the Allies were their oppressors in their mind to their independence. Except in the case where Japan, where we liberated, many Asian countries from Japan, there was appreciation there. So while the United States did a terrible atrocities to the Philippines in the American-Philippine War, the Americans are going to liberate the Philippines from a very, very brutal occupation by the Japanese. And then the same is going to go with Korea, okay? So, but what we should keep in mind is that for the West, the communists always seem pretty straightforward bad. But if you look at the Depression, so if I put all this together, keep in mind, if we look at all the history that we've covered up to this point, the United States has been very chaotic. Wealth has been very little disseminated. We had the Roaring '20s. We started getting to see like a little more, people having fun, but it still wasn't everybody, not for people of color. And at the end of World War I, we see that the Soviet Union comes into being. And this is the first country in the world that workers took power at the expense of the capitalists, overthrew their bosses. And so again, this was a horror to the business class and kind of an inspiration to many of the working class. And then by the time we get to the Depression, capitalism is really seeming undermined, and the Soviet Union having its own problems, but not necessarily knowing what's going on over there. Again, many people thought, well, goodness, I mean, we're hearing how bad communism is, but we're staying in lines for one cup of soup and no consumer goods and blah blah, all the things that are associated with a failed system. And then at the end of World War II, what you're going to see is that it's Stalin who defeats Hitler, not us. And so the Soviet Union, right at the end of World War II, from many different countries, is going to look really, really good. And Stalin is going to be an inspiration to a lot of people in the world, even many Americans, for that reason. And so, but yet, it wouldn't take long before people got information about Stalin and what was happening, that the Soviet Union and the Communist Party would lose a lot of prestige. But this kind of also explains why so many artists and writers and famous people were sympathetic towards communism at this time. Now, what I'm incorporating also in these lectures and with some of these documentary clips is a little clip of the Spanish Civil War. A lot of you don't know that just before World War II, there was a war in Spain. And this is what inspired the writer who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm, if you remember that. Just like now in Syria or in Islamic countries where many Muslims from around the world will go and fight on behalf of a Muslim cause, many Americans and British and other people who are leftist, believed in democracy or communism or anarchism, actually went to Spain illegally to fight on the side against fascism, where Hitler and Mussolini were supporting a Franco. Now, this may confuse you or lose you, but just know that in Spain, that the black shirts, the fascists, Hitler and Mussolini, they were first getting involved in Spain in a civil war as a testing ground, in which many Americans actually traveled there to go support and fight against the wishes of our own government. And even though later our own government was going to fight to defeat Hitler and Mussolini, many of these who went there were actually under suspicion by the U.S. government, because many were communists and basically were going over there to fight kind of without U.S. permission at the time. So, the world had a lot of crazy things going on. And if you look at various artists and movies and writers, Hemingway and Picasso, and if you know, what I want you to understand is that these time periods right here greatly affected so many things, even in popular culture, that maybe now a lot of you are not following. And with the advent at the end of World War II and going into the Cold War, I just want to say this: when I was in high school, I was going to Downey High. Close to basically to the end of my just about the time of graduation is when the Soviet Union fell. Prior to that time, everybody in America just worried about communists. I mean, I remember my grandparents, may they rest in peace, everything. Somebody got a cold, you'd blame communists. I mean, the fear of Russians was tremendous, and the fear of a nuclear war, between Russia and the United States, and it's just, I can't underestimate the different way in which we thought and how our culture was in our approach to the Cold War as to the way it is now. And that the way that the war on terror, which I'm not going to have time to go into, is kind of an offshoot of the Cold War, because many of these current terrorist groups were actually supported by the United States government for being so anti-communist. There's a lot of the world now is a mess because of also the residual effects that happened from the Cold War that we're going into at the end of World War II. So, I mean, this all is just big material again, and we're just shoving it down your throat here in this 1 week. So, even if you don't follow all of what I just said, or necessarily all these lectures, I want you to understand the absolute importance of understanding these things on a broader role, okay? And understand that World War II was more than just Hitler and the Holocaust and Pearl Harbor. That the Cold War was more than just Stalin, and the United States played a heavy role in all of this, drama. But don't forget to integrate us into, conceptualizing the fact that, now we're talking about the United States as a global player interacting on many different levels and different theaters of war and politics. Okay, so that's all I have to say on that, and then I'm going to just post the rest of the videos for this week.